Today we're going to learn how to use a charting framework to make our JavaScript display charts and graphs in a nice, easy to consume way. We're going to use C3, C3.js, which is a variation or a subframework of D3.js. D3 is a more robust, really large, great graphing library that we will learn in this class, but we're going to start with C3 and getting a good understanding of how to build charts and graphs in an easy way. We're going to understand how to use JSON files and how the objects work. And once we understand that, it'll make the transition to D3 really easy. So let's start with C3.js. If you go to C3.js.org, you can see a demo of, here is a line chart that we're going to do, and you can click through and watch this. But what we're going to do is always go to the getting started. That's what I do the first time I want to learn a new framework or a new language. I go to that getting started guide to make sure that I can get it working exactly like they suggest. And then I go from there to start making my own changes. On the Getting Started guide, you'll see it sets it up and says, here's the latest C3 version. And so you can download the source code and then unzip that file. And so you're going to unzip that, and it's going to give you this folder right here. Now, there's a lot of files in here that we're not going to use and we don't really need right now. All we really need is the minimized CSS files and the minimized JS file. So one thing I like to do first is let's go ahead and copy those. So I'm going to hold down Option and I'm copy the JS file into my JS folder and copy the CSS file into my CSS folder. So now I have those and I'm not going to use this folder anymore. Okay. Now back on this Getting Started guide, you'll see we have a link to our CSS file, so we need to include that. I'm going to put that in the top. Notice it says path to, and so since we put this in CSS, we'll do that. And then we'll also have links to our JavaScript file. Now note that they are linking to a dependency, and this dependency is D3. And so we'll need to go get D3, but let's just go ahead and copy these script files because the order matters. Any dependency that you have, like a plugin is dependent upon jQuery, C3 is dependent upon D3. So we want to make sure that the dependency comes first. So D3 will come first, then C3, then our actual file that we're going to be editing and creating our own code in. So we need to go get D3. So just go ahead and search for d3.js. It's d3js.org. And you'll see right here it gives us the script file for this. Okay. Now, one thing you'll notice is they're up to version 6 now, and C3 is suggesting version 5. Well, I like to use the newest version, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in and show you what happens if you happen to choose the newer version. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Let's see what happens here. So we've got that in there, and then we need a path to our JS file, and so we're going to change that to JS/. And then we have our file ourselves. So save that, and then let's go back to delete that one. We're going to go back here and check and see what's the next step. So we need to generate a chart, and we are going to put an ID in our page. And so in this case, it's called an ID of chart, and we'll put that in our HTML. And then we will see this function here. It's called the generate function, and so it's going to be c3.generate. So look in the C3 namespace and generate, call that function, and then pass this information to it. So previously in our functions that we've written, we've only passed one piece of data in there. Here, we're going to pass a large object that's going to contain lots of data and information that's going to control how that chart gets rendered. So what I want you to do is to copy this whole set of code, and let's walk through what it does. So I'm going to go to my main.js file, and I'm going to paste it in there. So globally, we declare a new variable called chart. It runs the generate function and passes in where to place the chart. So this is an ID, right? So it says bind it to the chart ID, which is our ID right here on our HTML. And then we pass a little bit of data, and by default, it's going to do a line graph. That's just the way C3 is set up. If you don't declare a chart type, it automatically does it as a line graph. So let's just save it and do exactly the way the getting started guide does. Save it and see where we are and what problems we may need to deal with. Okay. First thing is we get two errors. Number one is a CSS error, and when it says file not found, we know that that's probably something that I screwed up. And yes, this should be c3.min.css. And then, so that one should be easy. We refresh, and now we still get this other error. Okay, uncaught type error. d3.set is not a function. Well, this is probably a difference between version 5 and version 6 in D3. So whenever I'm working on, kind of getting things started, it's helpful to just do it exactly like they got it in their getting started guide or the tutorial you're using. So if I go back up here and look, it says, oh, version 5. Let's change this to version 5 and make sure we got that. I'm going to save it, and let's see if that gets rid of our error. And yes, it does. So there's been a major change in this particular situation in version 6 of D3. But C3 hasn't caught up to that, so we need to use version 5. And that's perfectly fine. What we're doing, it's not going to matter. And so it's perfectly fine to use the version 5. And so we're going to do that. So we have all our files loaded, we have our chart working, and now that I have it working, I say, yes, this is great. Now let's see if I understand what's happening. So we put this on an ID. So if I change that to a 2, it should fail. It does, but I don't get an error. So let's see what it is if I change this to chart 2, save it, and now it works. So we've got to be able to make sure our IDs match up. So let's take that back, but just to kind of plug and play to try to test and see what works and what doesn't. How is this working? So here we have data 1. You see it's in quotes, so it's a string, so it should be able to handle spaces and things. We'll call this UNC. We'll call this one that other blue school. We'll save it and hit refresh, and you'll see we are always on top, and it did handle the spaces, so because this is a string, and so we know that works. And I could even go ahead and change this to a better number, and again, I'm just trying to understand what everything's doing. So we have two columns of data, and those two columns of data basically have an array because this is an object. Okay, so this object has nested nodes, and then inside this node called columns is this array of data that has a string followed by all that information, all those data points. Okay. Now, let's go back to our getting started guide. So our generate chart is working. So that's really great. We're not going to use this require part, so we can leave that out. Now, there are a lot of other examples you can go do, and we'll look at those in a minute. But let's keep going with customizing this particular chart. So one of the things we can do is add an axis to it. So we're going to come here, and you'll see remember this is an object, and so whenever we add a node to an object, we need to put a column in. So this closes columns. Sorry, I said column. We need to put a comma in, and then we're going to add our new node called axis. And then this is a string where we're adding in that data2 was going to have something on the y2 axis. So now we refresh this, and you'll see we have the axis giving us data and information. Now let's keep walking down this, and we can add this other node. Sorry, I got an extra curly bracket in there when I copied and pasted. It needs a comma because we have added a new node, and we also want to make sure our spacing is right and makes sense. So here we have, make sure we show it. So we added this axis, but it didn't do anything. It didn't change it. Now we're setting it to true. So let's go back and look at that. I refresh this, and now you can see the second axis. Okay. So coming back, all I'm doing is making sure I'm understanding what's happening in the object data that we're passing to the charts. Okay. So that works just like it shows it should work. And so we can keep going. We want to add a label. So instead of copying all of this, I want to make sure that I, as the developer, understand what I'm putting in my code. So I'm not going to just copy the whole thing. I'm going to copy this one part. So let's make sure I get it right. So we have the axis, and then we have another axis called y, and then we have y2. So let's make sure we put this in the right spot. So what I'm doing is I'm matching the code that is here with the code here to make sure I copied it exactly right. So this is to see if this is nested or not. So this needs to be back a level, and that's back a level. Okay, so now let's save it and refresh it. And I've got my Y label because it says it's there. So the text says Y label. I could change this to any string. And so that's working. And then where it gets positioned is based off the API. So there's a position called outer middle, so outside and centered, which you could find in the documentations for the C3 documentation. So now let's go ahead and add a node to the right side. So see, we already have y2 show true. All we need to do is add this part to add in the label. So what am I missing? I need a comma. So don't forget your commas, and don't add one to the last item. So now if I refresh this, you'll see I have one over on the right. Okay. So as you walk through this, you'll see all the different things that you're able to change and do. One of the things we may want to do is change the chart type. So we currently have a line graph, we might want a bar graph. And so we can do that by adding the type node. So here on the data to y2 axis, we're going to add a type. So data to y2, add a comma. I guess I didn't copy it. Let's try again. There we go. Keep it nice and clean. And save it. We'll refresh again. And it failed. So what I missed is remember when I changed these to different names, this is looking for data 2, and data 2 was defined as y2. Data 2 does not exist here. So if I were to change this back to data 2, this should work. I hit refresh, and now I have my bar graph, okay? So this does matter. So let's just change this to something that makes sense, okay? And then now data 2 is really called Duke and Duke. And now it works in both cases. So I changed my type to bar because by default it was already a line graph. And then I have to make sure that these all match up to whatever this is being called in the first item here, because that's just the way that this particular library is set up to receive it. Okay. So you refresh, you get your bar chart, and it works. Okay. Now, as we go down, you can format the values, you can learn how to add commas and all these things. I want you to walk through and practice steps 4 all the way through the very end to the end of this 5. It's actually not called 5, it's called 1 line style. So go all the way down to this line style part as your assignment. I want you to do that. I also want you to not only edit and change this chart using the documentation you see, but I want you to create a second chart on the page. So we're going to make a new chart. And the only thing I'm going to tell you is you're going to add a new div. We're going to call this chart 2. And then you're going to go here and you're going to have another function, another variable that is declared called, we'll just call it chart 2. And then I'm going to stop it right there. And that's the only hint you get. Okay. So now what I want you to do here is to put in a pie graph into right below the first chart into the second chart. Okay. So how could you do a pie graph? Well, you're going to come up here after you go through the getting started guide with the other one and go to examples. And in examples, you'll see all these different kinds. You'll come down here to pie chart and view the details, and you'll see this is a rotating pie chart that basically does all kinds of things, and you can click on it and do different things. But all I want you to do is to show a pie chart with 2 numbers. Okay, one pie chart with 2 numbers. So let's look at what you've got. You've got a variable, you have some column data with 2 numbers, they have IDs, then you have a type. Okay, now you have some on click events, on mouse over events, on mouse out. You have some events that are happening. I don't care about that. You can leave them in, take them out, whatever. What I want you to do is to get this working as a basic chart. Now what I don't want is these extra functions here for these events around timeout, because I don't want it rotating. I want one chart. So can you get this to a bar chart with a line chart, so that the same above, and a pie chart right below it? Okay. So I want you to do that for class. Bring that to class and we'll talk through and we'll keep advancing on C3.